So if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll probably have realized that ever since delves were introduced in the War Within, I have been playing quite a lot of delves. I've been doing tons of different videos on delves, the best loadouts for your companion, the best ways to farm certain delves, pretty much everything about delves and how to get the most out of them. And while it may seem like delves would be my main endgame content, it's actually not true. I actually do tons of Mythic Plus. I'll usually do some heroic raiding and usually try to complete the raids at least in a pug and maybe do a few mythic bosses. And with all of that being said, I still really like running delves, especially when it comes to doing it on ults to gear them up, even more especially when it comes to farming gold, farming specific materials, which has actually been really good both in the War Within and now in Midnight, where you could just farm quite a lot of gold through some of the more rare materials. So there's quite a lot to like within delves and a lot of reasons to run them, but I think Blizzard may actually be making the future of delves be a lot more substantial than it is right now. And I think we have a bunch of information pointing to that being the case. And the delve system that was introduced with the War Within is primarily a solo endgame piece of content and endgame system. You can do it with up to groups of 5, and while in the first season of the War Within, pretty much everybody was running it in groups, especially early on, because it was so much more easy. As they've started to balance it, I think most people who do delves as their specific endgame content are doing it as solo content. I don't think it's a stretch to say that would be the majority of people, and I think that's still how they're seeing and developing the system, where they allow for it to be done in groups with other people. It is kind of more focused on solo players and giving solo players actual endgame content that can progress their characters pretty heavily. And that brings me into another one of the parts in which why I think Blizzard is actually going to be taking the delve system and make it much more into its own full endgame system. And I actually think in the future, specifically in this expansion, we will see the ability to get myth track items from the delve system, or more specifically, one of the new features of the delve system we're getting in a later patch. Because starting off in the War Within, delves were still pretty good for early gearing, but it wasn't near as good for more endgame gearing as it is now. Because in this first season of Midnight, as you progress throughout your delve journey track, you can just start to get hero track gear as drops throughout the delve itself, which you weren't able to do in the War Within. Normally, you would only be able to get hero track from your Great Vault, and then you're able to start to get champion track gear for all of your ults. I think that's also something that delves are really heavily used for. I use delves for this quite a lot, because in this first season of Midnight, once you get the upgrade to where you can get champion track warbound gear from those delves, it becomes absurdly strong for just gearing up new alt, because you can just farm delves over and over and over again, pretty much infinitely, and you can get tons of champion track gear for your alts and just have like a full set for them, where you can bring them in the Mythic Plus or whatever other content you want to do. So the gearing of delves specifically has kind of progressed to allow you to get better and better loot, culminating in what we have right now in Midnight, and then kind of even taking it further, because then you can also use reroll tokens on delves right now, which while it doesn't go into myth track right now, you can still use your reroll tokens in delves to remove loot from that. So if you're looking for a specific item, because delves in general still do have some really strong, more rare items in them, so you can use it for that to get guaranteed hero track gear and to just remove the ability to get that gear, to whittle down the drops you can actually get to try to target farm the thing you actually want more and more. And gearing and power progression is actually being expanded even a bit more going into 12.1. At a baseline, we're getting reroll tokens right at the start of a season is going to be a permanent feature of the game, so you can still use those in delves like you do now. But there's also another piece of power progression specifically for outdoor players or people doing delves, which are called corrosive souls. Essentially in 12.1, they're doing a bunch of different content. You can get these corrosive souls, which you're essentially putting special effects on belts or wrist pieces that give one of like 12 different effects. That is kind of borrowed power for the entirety of the patch, but it's also just kind of these seemingly pretty strong cantrip effects only for outdoor content or delves. And there's a bunch of different ones that give damage procs. There's ones that kind of give you buffs while draining your health, so you're like poisoning yourself. And there's a dozen different ones you can get that you just kind of have to keep trying to reroll on your gear by getting more and more of these corrosive souls. So while this isn't going into like myth track gear, this is giving open world players and even more specifically delve players better gear and more power progression specifically on these two pieces. Because realistically, if some of these corrosive soul enchants end up being quite strong, you would technically be taking like a 6 out of 6 hero track piece of gear and kind of bringing it up to myth track because you're putting this enchant that gives you even more power on it people running dungeons or raids couldn't have. And while this may be a system they don't bring forward past 12.1, the reason I'm talking about this is because this is just kind of showing the progression of what they're doing specifically to delves and solo players that mainly run delves, is that they are increasing the loot you can get, increasing the player power you can get, that I think is going to culminate in one of the main things I wanted to actually go over in this video, in labyrinths. Now, if you've never heard of labyrinths, that kind of makes sense because this was essentially just a few pieces of concept art and a name for a piece of content coming in 12.1.5, which is probably going to be late September. So more than likely, they're going to be showing off this full system at BlizzCon, which I think makes sense because I think this is actually going to be a pretty massive system being added into the game. And if they make this content well, this is essentially going to be adding kind of mega dungeon or raid style content specifically for delves and solo players. Now, they specifically called labyrinths kind of like a mega dungeon or like a mega delve. And while they showed a piece of concept art for this, they also showed a map layout of what we could expect from this. And this looks much more like a map layout that you would see in an actual raid. There is this big center chamber. There's all of these different rooms with multiple paths going to them. And more than likely, every single one of these different labeled areas is going to have a different objective and more than likely a different boss within them. All of them may not have bosses, but what's also really interesting is that on this image, they labeled it as labyrinths, a new delve format, which is pretty interesting. And because this is so massive, this isn't necessarily going to be something that you should be doing or that they expect you to be doing in one playthrough. So I think because of that, this is going to be a raid equivalent. Specifically a raid equivalent for solo players or small group players up to 5 players. But comparing it to mega dungeons doesn't make as much sense because usually with a mega dungeon, you would go in there and do the full mega dungeon in one sitting. But in raids, unless you're on like farm or something, raids, you're not really doing that. And I think that's what they're targeting with this. I think they're targeting for this to be really long and that you're not supposed to be doing it in one sitting. And it's supposed to be pretty long. And I'm hoping there are a bunch of much more substantial objectives and much more substantial boss fights. Now, sticking to the theme of this video, going through the progression of getting better and better gear throughout delves, throughout the development of the system as a whole, and getting even more player power going to 12.1, 12.1.5 may even be adding the ability to get myth track gear from these labyrinth runs. And they did also say that the rewards from these labyrinths are going to probably be a different system compared to normal delves. We're not exactly sure what that means, but what's really interesting is that now that the reroll tokens are going to be just a main part of the game, and you can start getting them right at the start of the season, in 12.1.5, we will have reroll tokens. A lot of people will have probably built up a good chunk of reroll tokens, and there's a good possibility that going into labyrinths, reroll tokens will be able to get you myth track gear. Not sure if just doing these labyrinths could give you myth track gear or something, but I think it's almost a guarantee that using reroll tokens in this new labyrinth delve system on the highest difficulty will be able to give you myth track gear. And I'm very curious at what other loot these are going to give, because even if you go in here and say every objective or boss you complete in one of these labyrinths gives hero track gear, you can kind of already do that in normal delves. My assumption more with this is that these labyrinths are going to kind of be giving the loot you would expect from doing tier 11 delves with keys. So let's say there's a boss in every single one of these different rooms on this map mockup, and you go and start defeating the boss in these rooms, that I would probably expect it doesn't require the keys that normal delves do, but you're probably still going to be getting loot like it was a bountiful tier 11 delve that you used a key on. And then it would also make sense that above that, you use your reroll tokens within this and you can get myth track gear only out of labyrinths, which would be another pretty massive escalation of allowing solo players to get even more power and pretty much create a full endgame journey specifically for solo players. Now, like I mentioned, the developers did say that the labyrinths would probably be having a different reward structure than normal delves. We don't know if that means you would still be getting the benefits of your delver's journey, or if the labyrinths would maybe have their own delver's journey, or just have a different reward structure. But I can't help but think the corrosive souls we went over previously in this video are kind of a test for things we could see in labyrinths, because whether or not they allow us to get, say, myth track gear from using our reroll tokens within these labyrinth runs, whether or not we can get myth track gear from those corrosive souls and having those special enchants on gear only available outside of dungeons or raids makes me think that may be a test for something that they would be doing in labyrinths. Because as I said when going over those corrosive soul items, that if those enchants end up being quite strong, and let's say you get a hero track piece of gear from a delve run, which you can do, and you upgrade it to 6 out of 6, and then you put this enchant on that piece of gear that you can't have in dungeons or raids, if that enchant is strong enough, that piece of gear kind of becomes myth track in terms of the overall power it gives. So there could be another way in which they just give more power through these labyrinths that isn't specifically going up to myth track gear, and it could be adding these type of enchants or maybe even unique gear that is stronger specifically while doing solo content or not doing dungeons or raids. They could maybe have like a different type of gear, like maybe it would be labeled something different, like maybe it would be labeled labyrinth, and maybe that gear, while it wouldn't be on myth track, maybe it would have like these much stronger cantrips or special effects on them that just gave you a lot more power while doing that solo content. And I think what this would allow is that it wouldn't force players who don't really want to do delves, who want to do raids or dungeons, it wouldn't force them into doing labyrinths, because realistically, if they allow you to get myth gear out of labyrinths, even with a reroll token, dungeon players or raid players may feel like they need to do that at some point, especially if there's some piece of gear in there that has a good cantrip, or some piece of gear in there that has the perfect stat weights for the spec they're playing. They may feel like they have to go to the labyrinth and use a reroll token on it to try to get that piece of gear, but if they kept it at only be able to get hero track out of labyrinths, but this labyrinth gear just has these crazy strong effects, only work outside of dungeons and raids, you would still be getting pretty massive power increases like you were getting myth track gear. It would just more essentially be getting myth track gear that's only able to be used in the kind of open world content which delves are a part of. And if you want to get even more crazy with the possibilities, they could possibly add like a tier set specifically for Labyrinth. Now, this one's a bit more far-fetched because I think a good amount of players who just want to do Mythic Plus have been asking for something like this for quite a long time, where you essentially just get like a tier set that's specific to Mythic Plus, that's better for Mythic Plus. So it kind of opens a can of worms that Mythic Plus players would then want it, and then PvP players would also want tier sets that are specific to PvP. While I do think it's far-fetched, that is another kind of cool idea. Now, that doesn't mean they can't make the smaller tier sets. Like in a lot of raids, it will have like maybe like a ring and a trinket or something that makes its own small tier set. They could definitely do stuff like that. They could add really cool cantrips. They could add crazy different stat weights if they're not allowing for you to obtain mythic gear in these. Because if you can't obtain mythic gear in these, they can allow for kind of crazier stat weights within this that kind of mimics some of the super rare drops from raids. Specifically, one of the rings in this first season, specifically you'll find on last bosses of the raids in the past couple expansions will have like a super rare item like a ring or something that has almost all of its stats, or in some cases literally all of its secondary stats in one stat. So like a ring with just all crit on it, which is ridiculous for people who want crit. They could even do something like that as well with Labyrinths, to where you're kind of getting this really crazy gear that's just not on Myth Track. So there is a ton they could do with Labyrinths, and I am very excited to see what they're finally doing with this, because unless they somehow make the concept of Labyrinths completely horrible, which it's World of Warcraft, I think one of the things they do really well is making dungeons or delves or bosses or raid bosses or anything like that, they generally make any of that combat focused content very good in pretty much the entirety of the history of the game. That has always been the stuff that has always been top notch and top of the genre. So I seriously doubt they can mess this up enough to where people won't really like Labyrinths. And if people really like Labyrinths, they're going to keep making them. So I am very curious to see how hard these Labyrinths are going to be, what the content is actually going to be. Like, is every single one of these rooms going to have its own boss? That's something I would think was really cool. And then I'm very, very curious to see the reward structure they go with these Labyrinths. And I think this is a system of the expansion I'm actually most excited for. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.